The next morning, a fiery red Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up in front of the showroom, and as the back door opened, froze, his eyes widening in shock. He never expected this to happen. Karoline Leavitt entered the showroom and asked about the opulent Azure coupe. The salesman, Blake Thompson, looked at her up and down with a sneer and laughed as he pointed toward the exit, saying, "This isn't the place for MAGA folks like you." After a long day at the White House, Karoline Leavitt, 27, the youngest White House press secretary in history under the Trump administration, entered the Capital Luxury Motors dealership in Washington, D.C. She was dressed in a white button-up shirt, black dress pants and low heels, making her look polished but laid back. She was prepared to confront him before diving into the story. Comment where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. This luxury dealership in the center of Washington, D.C. catered to the political elite with shiny Porsches, Bentleys and Ferraris behind glass. But underneath the glitz was a staff of liberal leads, S's in management, who had little affection for the MAGA crowd. Karoline needed a new car, the Azure coupe, as her work vehicle. This was not just a passing remark between press briefings, it was a bold statement against the left-wing media that constantly criticized her and the president. The air smelled of new leather and pricey cologne as she strode through the glass doors with her phone in hand, pushing open the entrance to Capital Luxury Motors. A tiny chime sounded as she entered the large room, which was illuminated by LED lights and featured a fiery red Porsche 911 Turbo, a glossy black Bentley Continental, and a fiery yellow Ferrari SF90 on a display pedestal. She looked around the showroom, focusing on the Azure. A young voice said, "Hello, ma'am, how may I help you?" Daniel, a new employee, out 25, wearing a slightly oversized suit, approached with a shy smile and said, "I'd like to see that Azure coupe, Karoline." The car was a midnight blue masterpiece with sharp lines, priced at $285,000. It was precisely what she needed, a car that was both powerful and sophisticated enough to take her from the White House to press briefings. Daniel Lake Thompson, the sales manager, looked about 40, tall and broad, wearing an expensive gray suit, his slicked back hair gleaming, his eyes radiating smugness, and he was a staunch liberal. He pointed to the car calmly but firmly, nodding, and beginning to say, "It's got a V8 engine and a hand-stitched leather interior, perfect for..." But before he could finish, a figure interrupted. "I'll take it from here." Blake adjusted his tie, sizing Karoline. He said, "Hello, I'm Blake Thompson, manager. What are you looking for?" "Karoline, he repeated, ignoring his stare. "I want to see the Azure coupe," he said, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. Blake smirked, stepping between her and the car. "Are you sure this is a limited edition? Not just anyone can buy it." Karoline frowned slightly. "I know what it is," he said. Blake crossed his arms and sneered. "You look familiar. Hold on." He tilted his head and his eyes brightened as if he had finally put it all together. "Oh, I remember now. You're Karoline Leavitt, right? Trump's press secretary." He emphasized Trump like it was a curse, raising his voice and drawing looks from nearby customers. Karoline nodded, her expression unchanging. "That's right. I need this car for work." Blake laughed, the harsh sound reverberating through the showroom. "You mean running to press briefings too?" he said. He turned to Daniel and winked, hearing that Maggie knows how to play fancy too. Daniel lowered his head, visibly uneasy but silent, and Karoline stood tall with her voice steady. "I'm not dreaming. I want to buy it today. Can you please show me the car?" Lake stopped laughing, but the SMB lingered. He stepped closer, leaning down as if he were speaking to a human. I thought you were just good at talking about outdated policies, and I didn't peg you for dreaming about luxury cars.
I don't know where you get your money, Miss Leavitt. Probably from MAGA nations, but this is Capital Luxury Motors, and we serve clients with taste and social awareness, not showy conservatives. Caroline's tone sharpened slightly as she said, "You mean refusing customers based on politics? I need a car to do my job efficiently, not to please you or anyone else." Blake shrugged, unfazed. "Don't think this car fits with Trump."
You don't need to care what I use it for. I'm a customer, I have money, and I want to see the car. Blake stepped back, eyeing her as if she had said something ridiculous. You're serious? Coming in here with that outfit and that cheap necklace? Who do you think you are to demand an azure coupe? Whispers spread a smile on your face. Karoline clenched her fists, but she kept her trademark composure in the face of leftist reporters. I don't have time for MAGA stunts, Miss Leavitt. If you want a car, schedule an appointment like a normal person. Otherwise, I suggest you try somewhere else. Tesla. It might be for the environment. Karoline met his eyes and said in a low but firm voice, I don't need your suggestions. I want this car, Blake. A couple near the Ferrari turned to look, and two other salespeople murmured, one of them laughing. Daniel with his eyes on the floor, obviously wanting to disappear. Blake crossed his arms, his gaze daring. The midnight blue Uriol coupe was still shining quietly on its pedestal, but the air around it felt heavy now. Don't you get it? This is my turf, Thompson said, his icy arms crossed tightly as if protecting his turf in the Capital Luxury Motors showroom. Whispers from customers and employees ran through the room, blending with the soft background music from ceiling speakers. Her eyes were as sharp as when she faced leftist reporters at the White House in her black pants and white shirt. Your turf, she said, her tone calm but heavy, sharpened from sparring on national television. I thought this was a dealership, not a political club. I have money. I want to buy the Azurupe. What's your reason for refusing me? Blake laughed, a short, dry laugh that sounded like a slap. Karoline furrowed her brow, but remained calm, saying, Look at you, that cheap MAGA necklace, that attitude, like you own the world. You're Rump's people, and we don't welcome your kind here. Blake moved closer, leaning down until his face was level with hers, his breath tinged with bitter coffee. Oh, I can miss Leavitt. This is a private matter. The whispers in the showroom became louder. A middle-aged man in a blue suit near the Bentley whispered to his wife, Who is she? Trump's press secretary responded, I've seen her on TV. Another salesperson with dyed blonde hair giggled and whispered to a colleague, Blake's teaching her a lesson, Daniel, the same way. Business. I decide who gets served. I don't want dirty MAGA money tainting this place. Karoline took a deep breath and said, Dirty money? You're talking about what I earn from my job representing millions of Americans. By not serving
Me, you're insulting them. Blake shrugged and turned to face the small crowd, saying, Listen up, everyone.
His voice boomed across the showroom like an actor on stage, but Karoline was too scared to stop the young employee who was standing a few steps away with a brochure in his hand. A few people laughed from the corner. The man next to the Bentley nodded, and his wife covered her mouth as she giggled. However, not everyone agreed. An older woman in a grey sweater frowned. She just wants to buy a car. What's wrong with that? Blake ignored her, turning back to Karoline and pointing at the glass doors. You heard them. I don't care if you're press, secretary or anything. Get out now. Leavitt here wants to use MAGA money to buy our cars. Karoline refused to move, saying, I'm a customer, not a troublemaker, and you have no legal grounds to kick me out. Blake moved closer until she could see the lines on his forehead. "I don't like you. That's enough. This is my turf. And I—" "Say you don't belong," he said, pointing harder at the door. His voice rose with defiance, and the crowd fell silent. Karoline looked at Blake, then at the curious faces around the showroom, some smirking, others uneasy. She knew she could call a lawyer, turn this into a lawsuit, but not right now. She said, her voice clear and low, ringing like a warning, "You want me gone? I'll go, but this isn't over." She turned to go to the glass doors, her heels clicking steadily on the marble floor, and Lake laughed loudly behind her. "Hello, Trump. Get me an electric car. It's more modern." A few more laughs followed, but Daniel bowed his head and muttered, "This isn't right," as Karoline pushed the door. Her small but determined figure was highlighted by the sunlight streaming in. Her hand clutched her phone, lips pressed into a tight line. Blake believed he had defeated the maggot crowd, but he was unaware that Karoline was leaving with a plan. The glass door closed behind her, the small chime ringing again like a period on the drama that had just transpired. But it wasn't the end. The showroom buzzed with whispers as Blake strutted back to his job, and Karoline, lightly pushed open the door of her old sedan, a silver Toyota Camry, with faded paint, slid into the driver's seat, and as the late afternoon sun dipped outside Capital Luxury Motors, a silent fire smoldered inside her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, and her eyes were fixed on the windshield, still hearing Blake Thompson's mocking laugh. She took a deep breath, took her phone out of her black dress pants, opened her contacts, and dialed the number twice before a deep, slightly raspy voice answered. "Karoline, are you okay, Nicholas?" Nicholas Rio, 59, who had been homeless, before transforming Rio Enterprises LLC into a multi-million-dollar real estate empire in New England, was calm but steady when she said, "I just got kicked out of a dealership in DC." Her husband was silent for a moment as she pictured him in his home office, his salt and pepper hair, slightly brown eyes narrowing. The manager, Blake Thompson, who knew me as Trump's press secretary, refused to sell me a car because I'm MAGA, called my money dirty, and said I didn't belong there. She recounted it in a calm but tinged with frustration, asking, "Who dared do that to you?" His voice dropping, edged with fury, Karoline started the car, and the engine hummed faintly as she pulled out of the lot. I wanted the Azure Coupe, for work to get between the White House and briefings to do my job, but he humiliated me in front of Nicholas, let out a sharp breath through the phone, which sounded like wind rushing through the receiver. What did he say? Karoline repeated Blake's remarks from the Trump jabs to the last challenge. "Get out, or I'll call security." She stopped at a red light, and I pushed back, saying that my money was as good as anyone else's, but he didn't care. He used his private business rights to drive me out, making fun of the president and making fun of him. Nicholas's voice was now clearly angry. Knowing her husband well, Karoline smiled faintly when she heard the creak of a leather chair he had likely stood up pacing. Their suburban DC home office. Nicholas wasn't just a successful real estate mogul who had fought his way up from nothing, sleeping on park benches in Hampton Beach before owning millions of dollars in property. Within months of the birth of their son, Nicholas Nico Robert, he had vowed to protect his family at all costs. "Who does he think he is insulting you like that?" Nicholas said, rising. The White House press secretary, speaking on behalf of the president, calls your money dirty. Does he realize how hard you work? Karoline merged onto the highway, city lights flickering in the distance. He isn't concerned about Nicholas. To him, I'm everything. He hates Trump MAGA for everything. Nicholas went silent for a while before asking, "What do you want me to do?" Karoline pursed her lips, considering her options. She could file a lawsuit, feed it to conservative media, or let it. She wasn't the type to let go, though, and she said, slowly, "I don't want revenge. I want him to see his mistake because he thinks I'm weak, because I'm a young woman who supports Trump." "All right, I know what to do," Nicholas said with a low, meaningful laugh. Karoline frowned. "What do you mean? Just head home?" "Yes. Tomorrow I'll go there," he replied firmly. "So he won't forget that day, Karoline." Though she knew he rarely listened, she warned Nicholas not to overdo it when he was agitated. He repeated his tone, which was tinged with mischief. "I just want to show him how wrong he was to mess with my wife. You're Karoline Leavitt. No one gets to disrespect you." Karoline let out a soft laugh, her first since leaving the dealership. "All right." She heard him walking, possibly to the garage, where the $15 million Rolls-Royce Phantom, a deep red tint reminiscent of Mugger, was waiting. Karoline Leavitt drove her old silver Toyota Camry home, its headlights sweeping across the suburban streets of Washington, D.C. The faint hum of the engine mixed with her thoughts about the call she had with her husband, Nicholas Rio. "Tomorrow."
I'll go there. He won't forget that dar, Nicholas said, his voice full of resolve.
Karoline smiled faintly, her hand brushing the Marga necklace. Though I'm still weighing her feelings, she turned onto the road leading to their two-story suburban home, a discreet villa far less ostentatious than the multi-million-dollar properties Nicholas owned in New Hampshire. The living room light glowed through the curtains as the car parked in the garage, and Karoline kicked off her heels as she entered the house. Blake Thompson had humiliated her in front of the entire Capital Luxury Motors showroom, not only because she was Trump's press secretary, but also because he believed she didn't belong. Saw Nicholas sitting in a leather chair in the tiny office, eyes fixed on his phone, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a simple grey shirt, and salt and pepper hair that was a little musky. He had been working on Rio Enterprises LLC that day, and blueprints of real estate projects were all over the desk, but he looked up as soon as he heard her say, "You're back." Nicholas's deep brown eyes flashed with anger and concern, and at 59, he still had the rugged frame from his difficult days in Hampton Beach. Karoline tilted her head and said, "I don't want revenge. I want him to see his mistake, not be ruined." Nicholas laughed with that familiar, mischievous smile she'd known since he was a child. "I'm fine, but I'm still thinking about the dealership. Blake didn't just refuse to sell me a car. He wanted to humiliate me to prove his liberal ideals were superior." Nicholas gripped his glass tighter, his knuckles whitening, and he said, "I'm not letting this slide easily." He walked to the office door and waved for her to follow him. He said, "Come here, I'll show you what I'm using." Karoline followed him through the dim hallway to the large garage in back, where the garage lights flickered it on and the Rolls-Royce Phantom, worth $1, was revealed. "I'm not buying the dealership to lay him off in New Hampshire, though I could." 5 million beasts painted a rich red that was evocative of the MAGA flag, with its custom beige leather interior and shiny chrome wheels. Nicholas patted the hood
And said, I had it custom made last year after Nico was born.
"Tomorrow, I'm driving it to Capital Luxury Motors. He'll see what he rejected isn't a joke." Karoline eyed the car, then her husband, and there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "Nicholas, what are you planning? Don't turn this into a flex." He shook his head, stepped closer, and put a hand on her shoulder. "I'll show him where beyond his little bubble." Karoline pressed her lips together, thinking, "But if you just buy the car, he'll think he won't change his mindset, that our money
Doesn't change.
Nicholas smirked, a spark lighting his eyes. "I'll invite him to a MAGA event. the Veterans Fundraiser Gala you're hosting next month, where he'll have to face the people he despises and see their true worth. That's how I'll teach him not to treat people disrespectfully." She nodded, leaning into him for a moment, and then asked, "You're smarter than I give you credit for." "I have to be to keep up with you," Nicholas said, pulling her into his arms. He lowered his voice and said, "I had aunts slept on park benches, but I learned that a person's worth isn't their looks or beliefs. I'll be the one to teach him that." Karoline laughed, feeling lighter for the first time that day. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'll go and step to open the automobile door." Monsieur Karoline gazed at him and then at the blazing red car beneath the garage lights. "All right, I want the whole specifics," Nicholas said. "You don't have to come. I'll take care of it. You'll love hearing how it goes." As he smiled back, bright morning sunlight streamed over Washington, D.C., glinting off the glass walls of luxuries.
Motors. The deep red Rolls-Royce Phantom, valued at $1, echoed a deep, powerful rumble.
A little group of people gathered by the door, some holding phones to record, as 5 million people slowly approached the dealership's entrance. They whispered, "What a car! And there must be someone big inside the showroom, Blake Thompson." The Rolls-Royce door opened, and Nicholas Riccio emerged at 59, tall and imposing. He was wearing a fitted dark grey suit, his hair was salt and pepper, and his sharp eyes were like those of a man who had built a real estate empire from nothing. The fiery red car behind him wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement echoing. The way he stood by the Bentley Continental, adjusting his grey tie and chatting with a wealthy client who was still smug about kicking Karoline Leavitt out yesterday. He and Karoline loved Nicholas, and he closed the door through the glass entrance of the dealership. The small chime sounded, but it was muffled by the sudden silence inside the showroom. Blake's smile turned to ice when he saw that customers and staff had stopped talking and were staring at the man who had just entered. Daniel, a young employee, was standing close to the reception desk, whispering to a colleague that the car was serious. Blake cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure, and stepped forward to block Nicholas. "Hello, sir. I'm Blake Thompson." Nicholas's deep voice carried through the showroom as he said, "I'm Nicholas Riccio. Yesterday, you refused to sell her a car because she's with Trump. What can I do for you today, sales manager?" His voice was smooth, but his eyes flickered with unease as they darted to the Rolls-Royce outside. Nicholas looked Blake up from head to toe, his gaze calm but icy. "I'm here to talk about that," he said. Blake blinked, opening and closing his
mouth as if his brain. Blake regained his composure and forced a crooked smile, saying, "Mr. Riccio, I'm afraid there's a misunderstanding."
"We didn't refuse anyone. It was just Nicholas. He cut him off with his voice sharp as a blade. "Don't lie. You called her money dirty, said she didn't belong, and kicked her out in front of everyone. I'm not here for that. Short-circuited whispers echoed through the crowd as the man near the Bentley muttered. The press secretary's husband nodded, and the press secretary's wife nodded. He pointed to the midnight blue car on the pedestal, and Blake swallowed hard, his hand tightening his tie. "Yes, of course we can," he said, realizing that he sounded too eager. "But I have to ask, are you serious about buying the Azure Coupe today?"
"It's a limited edition, not just for anyone." Nicholas interrupted again. "Excuse me, me. I'm here to buy the Azure CP she wanted." Towering over Blake, "I'm not asking for your opinion. I said, I want to buy it because my wife needs
it for work-related press briefings and White House events. You turned her down because you claim to despise Trump, but you don't know who she is or who I am." Richard Mason, the dealership owner, came out of the back office at around 50, looking anxious. and wearing a navy suit with his silver hair slicked back. "Owner, is there a problem?" Nicholas's tone remained the same. "The issue is that your manager humiliated my wife, Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, by refusing to sell her a car over politics. I'm here to fix that." Blake stumbled when he tried to interrupt. "Riccio, we just give priority to clients who care about social issues." Nicholas spun back his. Richard raised a hand to try to defuse the situation, saying, "Mr. Riccio, I apologize for this misunderstanding. We don't want to lose customers. You want the Azure. I'll handle it personally." "You seem socially conscious and think it's noble to kick out a woman who represents millions of Americans. You don't know anything about her. Karoline worked with Trump during an internship and ran for Congress. She is now the youngest press secretary ever." Nicholas nodded, but his eyes remained icy. "Good, I want the paperwork done today, but I'm not done with him." He pointed at Blake, who looked pale. "You thought you won by kicking her out, but you'll see the consequences. What are you going to do?" Blake stepped back, his voice shaky. "I'm not ruining you, but you'll learn that your liberalism doesn't give you the right to disrespect people." Nicholas grinned, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm not ruining you," he said, turning to Richard. After getting the car ready, Nicholas Rio stood tall in his grey suit, his sharp gaze fixed on Blake Thompson, who had gone pale at the words, "You'll see the consequences." Outside the glass doors, Drew continued to stare from the crowd, but inside, everyone's attention was on the standoff. Richard Mason, the owner, wiped sweat from his brow with his navy suit sleeve, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll tell him what he's doing next," said Nicholas Rio. "I apologize for yesterday's incident with Miss Litt, Nicholas." He nodded and looked at Blake. "Good," he said. "I want the paperwork done today. My wife needs the car for work press briefings
and White House events, so she doesn't have time for small-minded ideological games." He walked toward the midnight blue Azure coupe on the pedestal and ran a hand along its hood before turning back to Blake.
"I'm not just here to buy a car. You insulted her, and I'm not letting that slide easily." Richard raised a hand, cutting in on Miss Rio. "I never judged people for their beliefs, but he did." Blake was just when Nicholas interrupted him, saying, "Don't defend him." He called her money dirty and kicked her out like a troublemaker. Blake took a step back, his eyes darting between Nicholas and Richard, but his mouth still tried. "I am entitled to choose customers," Nicholas said, letting out a dry laugh that reverberated throughout the showroom. "Your right ends when you use it, toliate others. You think you're better than her because you're progressive, but you don't know anything about her, from Trump to the youngest press secretary ever, a congressional candidate. And now you're a car salesman who believes he can decide who's worthy." The audience was silent, and Daniel, the young employee next to the desk, whispered to a colleague, "He's right, Blake," his voice trembling, his eyes wide. He pointed, eyed where the red beast gleamed in the sun. "I built Rio Enterprises from scratch, own property across New England, and my wife and I don't need to prove anything to you, but you'll learn a lesson today." Richard hurried forward, his voice pleading, "Mr. Rio, I apologize on Blake's behalf, and we'll sell the Azure at the best price without any extra fees." Nicholas interrupted him again, his gaze piercing. "Don't want it, idiot, then? Why are you still here when I roll up in a Rolls-Royce?" Nicholas raised a hand to stop him. Nicholas turned back to Blake, his voice low but firm. "I could buy this dealership and terminate your employment today, but I won't. Instead, you'll attend the Veterans Fundraiser Gala Karoline's hosting next. I'll buy it, but not to make him happy. Karoline needs it. Where's the paperwork?" Richard nodded quickly, gesturing to Daniel to get the paperwork. Daniel hurried off while Blake stood frozen, hands clenched, unsure of what to do. Volunteer. Blake blinked and stammered. I don't think you will, Nicholas cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. Or I'll make sure no customer wants to deal with you again. Your choice. Richard interrupted. Blake will do it, not I. Blake will volunteer for a month, meet the people you despise, and see their true worth. Daniel ran up with a stack of documents and handed them to Nicholas. He reviewed them, nodded and said, Good, I want the car delivered to Karoline within 24 hours. Nicholas quickly signed the documents and gave them back to Daniel before giving Blake one last look. You thought you won by kicking her out, but you were mistaken. Your liberalism doesn't make you better than anyone, he said, turning to Richard. The Grand Hyatt Hotel in Washington, D.C. glowed brightly for the Veterans Fundraiser Gala hosted by Karoline Leavitt just a month after the incident at Capital Luxury Motors. Nicholas nodded as he walked to the glass doors, his shoes clicking steadily on the marble floor. Blake stood there, hands shaking, watching Nicholas and the Rolls-Royce outside. Some customers whispered among themselves, while others shook their heads at Blake. His smug pride had crumbled in a matter of minutes. There were banners with hundreds of veterans, their families, and conservative donors mingling with lively conversation, tables full of food, a band playing patriotic music, and a sense of pride in the air. Karoline, wearing a classy navy business dress, was standing close to the stage, talking to a group of former servicemen. Her eyes were shining as she thanked them for their service, and her subtle MAGA necklace glinted under the lights. Near the entrance, Blake Thompson was no longer in his, wearing an expensive grey suit but a basic black polo shirt. With a volunteer badge, he pushed a wheelchair for a 30-something veteran named Tom, who had lost a leg in battle. Blake leaned down to listen as Tom led him to the buffet, his voice soft. Okay, I'll get you some water. His face was quiet and even slightly awkward, unlike the smugness he had a month ago. Nicholas Riccio had made him attend this gala, and after weeks
of working with people he had once scorned, Blake was beginning to... I didn't expect you to actually show up.
Karoline's tone was calm but laced with subtle humor. She said, Look up, pausing the wheelchair. Your husband didn't give me much choice, he said. Lo, your husband didn't give me much choice. He said if I didn't have any customers left. Karoline nodded, looking at Tom, who smiled at her. I used to think MAGA was all showy, clueless types, but after a few weeks here, meeting people like Tom, I realized they're not the enemy I imagined Karoline crossed her arms to be. Thanks for being here today, Tom, she said, turning back to Blake. How does it feel working with these people? Is it what you thought? Blake paused, eyes dropping to the floor, then sighed, No. Blake nodded slowly, and his voice became quieter. I know I apologized to Mr. Riccio when the car was
delivered, but now I want to say it to you directly. I was wrong, Miss Leavitt. There's no excuse for how I treated you. Blake looked at me sharply, but not harshly. You were mistaken to judge me by my politics. You called my money dirty and kicked me out of the dealership because I'm with Trump. Blake's not bad. Miss Leavitt,
who helped me shoot hoops yesterday, is still pretty clumsy. But Blake laughed for the first time since coming to the gala, his eyes brightening. I'm learning, Tom, that you're a tough coach. Nicholas Ricci came out from behind, tall in a black suit, hands casually in his pockets, placing a hand on Karoline's shoulder and looking at Blake with eyes that weren't as cold as they'd been. He said to his wife, I've got to admit that he's trying. Then he turned to Blake. So is this gala what you thought MAGA was about? Blake shook his head. No, sir. I thought it would be all flash, but now I see that it's about community, about people like Tom Nicholas, who nodded his voice deeply and said, "Good." I had nothing once Blake slept on the streets penniless, but I learned that worth isn't in appearances or beliefs, but you're making it right. Mr. Rio Nicholas grinned and said, "I don't joke about business, but it's up to you." Karoline cut in. "Azure served me well and delivered on time with no issues, but next time don't. Let politics get in the way of your job." Blake nodded earnestly. "I won't thank you, Miss Leavitt and Mr. Rio. The company needs some new cars, so if you keep changing, I'll let you handle that deal." Blake wheeled Tom back to the buffet as the gala continued with music and laughter. His demeanor had softened, and Karoline and Nicholas stayed to watch, thinking he had changed. She asked Nicholas, "Maybe, but if not, I'll remind him that you are the most important thing to me." And she leaned into him with a smile. I am aware that the story of Karoline Leavitt and Nicholas Rio at Capital Luxury Motors profoundly reflects the political, and in the 2025 setting, Caroline White House press secretary was denied the Azure coupe by Blake Thompson because she was MAGA, a conservative symbol which he detested. This incident echoes current realities, where private businesses such as coffee shops or restaurants occasionally refuse service due to political stances, sparking debates about free speech and private property rights. Blake represents a segment of the American public. Karoline and Nicholas represent the tenacity of conservatives who refuse to be biased and use action, such as the fiery red Rolls-Royce and the MAGA Gala, to prove their worth. The lesson here isn't just don't judge a book by its cover. It's a more specific call in today's America. Progressive Americans who consider themselves superior, yet engage in the very intolerance they criticize in others. After working with veteran Tom, Blake learned to listen with respect instead of allowing politics to cloud judgment. Understanding that human worth is above classifications like progressive or MAGA. Nicholas didn't destroy Blake, but provided him an opportunity to make things right by proposing the automobile sale. When faced with confrontation, you can choose to pick instead of arguing. Use action to prove your value, like Karoline did when she drove the Azure through Washington, D.C. If you liked Karoline and Nicholas's narrative, then polarization doesn't define you. It defines how you react to it. Taught Blake a valuable lesson about respect outside of politics. To ensure you don't miss any more motivational stories like "Thank you for viewing," and I hope to see you in the upcoming MAGA journey.
Video